The ancient silence of the Blue Ridge Mountains shattered as Mike Donovan's axe bit into a fallen oak. Autumn sunlight filtered through the canopy above, casting dappled shadows across his weathered face. At 58, his body protested each swing with dull aches in joints that remembered decades of hard labor. But winter approached, and the old hunting cabin needed firewood before the first snow. Mike paused, wiping sweat from his brow despite the October chill. Something felt different in the forest today. 20 yards away, a robin ceased its chatter. The wind shifted, carrying a musky scent that made the hair on his neck rise. Years of living at the edge of wilderness had taught him to recognize the presence of a predator. He wasn't alone. With practiced calm, Mike set his axe against the log and slowly turned toward the sensation. There, partially obscured by young pines, stood a female black bear. She was massive for her species, her dark coat gleaming with health despite the season's drought that had left many forest creatures desperate for food. Their eyes met across the clearing, wary animal and experienced farmer, and in that moment, Mike felt something unexpected. This wasn't the typical curiosity of a bear investigating human activity. Her gaze held intelligence and something he couldn't quite define. Almost like recognition. Neither moved for what seemed like minutes. Then, as silently as she'd appeared, the bear turned and melted back into the forest. Mike released the breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Strange encounters with wildlife weren't uncommon in these parts, but something about this one lingered in his mind as he resumed his work. Little did he know that this brief meeting would be the beginning of an extraordinary chapter in his life, one that would challenge everything he understood about the relationship between humans and wild creatures. Mike Donovan had roots in these mountains that ran as deep as the ancient oaks dotting his property. Willow Creek Farm had been in his family for 3 generations. 60 acres of rolling pastures and apple orchards nestled against national forest land. Unlike many of his neighbors who'd sold to developers over the years, Mike had resisted the tempting offers. His connection to this land went beyond mere ownership. It was part of his identity. The locals of Pinecrest knew Mike as a man of few words, but generous actions. When spring flooding washed out the Wilson family's access road, it was Mike's tractor that cleared the debris before county services could even respond. During summer droughts, he opened his spring-fed pond to neighbors for emergency irrigation. He was respected not for grand gestures, but for the quiet reliability that defined his character. What few people knew was how deeply Mike understood the delicate balance between human needs and wildlife preservation. His father had taught him to see the land as borrowed, not owned, a philosophy that influenced every decision he made. When farmers in neighboring counties installed electric fencing that injured passing deer, Mike instead planted sacrifice crops at his property's edge, giving wild animals something to eat without venturing further into agricultural lands. His apple orchard operated on principles that minimized chemical use, making his farm a relative haven for creatures pressed by development elsewhere. But Mike's commitment to coexistence had been tested 3 summers ago when drought drove a young bear to raid his beehives. The financial loss was significant for a small-scale farmer, and pressure from agricultural extension agents to eliminate the problem bear had been substantial. Against advice, Mike had simply moved his hives closer to the house and installed better protection. His decision raised eyebrows among commercial farmers, but earned silent approval from old-timers like Harold Jenkins, who remembered when humans and wildlife maintained respectful boundaries without lethal intervention. The old hunting cabin, where Mike now worked, had been built by his grandfather, a simple one-room structure of local stone and timber that had weathered nearly 80 years of mountain seasons. Mike maintained it out of respect for his ancestors and occasionally used it during hunting season, though these days he preferred his camera to his rifle. The cabin stood an hour's hike from the main farmhouse, accessible only by a rutted trail, too narrow for vehicles. Its isolation made preparation essential, which explained his determination to stack enough firewood before darkness fell. As shadows lengthened across the forest floor, Mike's thoughts returned to the bear he'd encountered. Earlier, something about her deliberate examination of him seemed oddly personal. After 30 years in these mountains, he'd developed an instinctive understanding of animal behavior. Curious bears typically showed more interest in human objects than in humans themselves. Threatened bears displayed clear signs of aggression, but this bear had looked at him with what almost seemed like calculated assessment, behavior he'd never witnessed before. Shaking off the unsettling feeling, Mike focused on finishing his work. The weathered grey clouds building over distant peaks suggested an early storm, perhaps even the season's first snow at higher elevations. He had time to complete the cord of wood, but not much more before he'd need to start back. Reaching for his canteen, Mike discovered it nearly empty, another reason to finish quickly and return to the farm. With renewed determination, he gripped his axe and returned to the demanding rhythm of his labor. The first splatter of icy rain struck Mike's cheek as he secured the tarp over the neatly stacked firewood. What had been distant clouds just an hour earlier now loomed directly overhead, dark and heavy with moisture. Meteorologists had predicted clear skies, another reminder that mountain weather followed its own rules. Mike gathered his tools and secured them in the cabin's small storage shed, then paused to assess his situation. The sensible choice was clear: begin the hour-long trek back to the farmhouse immediately. But as wind whipped through the trees and temperature dropped precipitously, Mike's experienced eyes measured the storm's intensity against his aging body's speed. The rain was rapidly transitioning to sleet, coating the already treacherous trail with a slick surface that promised twisted ankles or worse. Darkness would fall in less than an hour, further complicating navigation through the dense forest. "Damn it," he muttered, reluctantly accepting the safest option. He would need to spend the night in the cabin and return at first light when conditions improved. It wasn't an ideal situation. Emma would worry when he didn't return, but he'd prepared for such possibilities. The cabin contained emergency supplies, canned food, matches, an old kerosene lamp, and blankets stored in a metal chest to protect. From mice, he had shelter and the newly stacked firewood. He would be uncomfortable but safe. Mike pushed open the cabin's heavy wooden door, wincing at the protesting creak of hinges that needed oil. Inside, the single room smelled of dust and disuse. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs occupying the center. A narrow cot with a thin mattress stood in the corner, and open shelves held basic cooking implements. It was sparse but functional, a shelter designed for necessity rather than comfort. As he kindled a fire in the stone hearth, Mike's thoughts turned to Emma. His wife of 35 years would check the window periodically when he was late, then begin calling his cell phone, which currently sat useless in his pocket, no signal reaching this remote location. After decades together, she would likely guess his situation correctly, but that wouldn't completely alleviate her concern. They had established protocols for unexpected circumstances. If he hadn't returned by dark, he would stay put until morning. Still, knowing Emma would worry despite her practical nature added a weight of responsibility to his predicament. The fire caught, spreading welcome warmth through the cabin as sleet intensified outside, rat-tatting against the single window like thrown pebbles. Mike opened the storage chest and inventoried his supplies. The picture was less reassuring than he'd hoped. Mouse-chewed blankets would provide minimal warmth in the rapidly cooling air. The food supplies were adequate, beans, corn, and beef stew in cans, but he discovered the matches had absorbed moisture, making fire starting a one-shot proposition. Most concerning was his water situation. With his canteen nearly empty and no running water in the cabin, he faced a night of mild dehydration. As darkness enveloped the forest, another problem emerged. one that Mike's preparations couldn't address. The distinctive sound of large animals moving through the underbrush circled the cabin at irregular intervals. Years of experience told him these weren't deer. The footfalls were too heavy, the movement too purposeful. Wolves had been reintroduced to distant parts of the forest, but seldom ventured this close to human habitation. Bears, however, were another matter, especially in autumn, when their desperate drive to accumulate calories before hibernation overcame natural caution. The realization settled uncomfortably in Mike's stomach. The female bear he'd encountered earlier might have been drawn by the scent of his sweat-soaked work clothes or the remnants of his lunch. Worse, the cabin itself likely smelled of old food from previous visits. Under normal circumstances, a bear would investigate and move on, but with forest food sources depleted by drought and early frost, desperation might override caution. The cabin's door was solid, but the window was secured by aging frames that might not withstand determined investigation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As sleet transitioned to snow and temperatures plummeted, Mike faced the sobering reality of his situation. The night ahead would be long and potentially dangerous, with insufficient warmth, limited water, and unknown wildlife activity outside. His immediate crisis wasn't dramatic like being lost or injured, but rather the slow-building challenge of insufficient preparation combined with deteriorating conditions. As an experienced outdoorsman, Mike knew such situations, not the obvious emergencies, but the gradual accumulation of small problems, often proved most dangerous. Outside, something large moved closer to the cabin wall, generating a scraping sound that made Mike instinctively reach for his axe. The long night had only just begun. Mike's relationship with the wilderness had been forged through generations of family history intertwined with these mountains. His grandfather, Joseph Donovan, had established Willow Creek Farm in 1938 during the tail end of the Great Depression, when the government sold parcels of foreclosed land at prices even struggling families could afford. Joseph had built this very cabin as his first shelter while clearing fields for planting, using techniques learned from Cherokee neighbors whose ancestors had inhabited these slopes for centuries before European settlement. The Donovan family story contained chapters that rarely emerged in Mike's conversations with neighbors. His father, Thomas, had once found an injured bear cub while clearing brush from a creek bed in the early 1960s. Against conventional wisdom, Thomas had wrapped the malnourished cub in his jacket and carried it home. For 3 weeks, the Donovans had secretly cared for the cub in their barn, feeding it from bottles until it regained strength. When wildlife authorities inevitably discovered their unauthorized rehabilitation, they'd expected severe penalties. Instead, the incident had led to Thomas Donovan helping establish the region's first wildlife rehabilitation protocols, creating a framework for legitimate rescue operations that eventually evolved into the Blue Ridge Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. This family legacy of respect for wild creatures had shaped Mike's worldview from childhood, where other farm children learned to see wildlife primarily as either resources to be harvested or threats to be eliminated. Mike absorbed more nuanced lessons. His father taught him to recognize individual animals by their behaviors and markings, not just to identify species, but to understand unique personalities. They tracked the same doe and her fawns across multiple seasons, noting how her behavior adapted to challenges. They observed how certain bears avoided confrontation, while others displayed bolder temperaments. This history explained Mike's reaction to the bear he'd encountered earlier. The intelligent assessment in her gaze had triggered not just wariness, but recognition, not of the specific animal, but of a quality his father had taught him to notice. Thomas had called it the old soul look, a rare quality in wild creatures that suggested deeper perception. Mike had encountered it perhaps 5 times in his life, always in older animals who'd had multiple non-threatening interactions with humans. Such animals maintained appropriate wariness, but demonstrated problem-solving abilities beyond instinctual responses. The Donovan family connection to bears specifically carried darker chapters as well. Mike's uncle James had been killed by a black bear in 1977, an extraordinarily rare occurrence that nonetheless shaped family attitudes. The investigation had revealed the bear was suffering from a brain parasite that altered its behavior, a finding that had allowed the Donovans to maintain their conservationist values despite personal tragedy. The incident had taught Mike that wilderness demanded respect rather than fear, and that aberrant animal behavior often indicated illness rather than malice. As wind howled around the cabin corners, Mike's thoughts drifted to more recent history. 3 years ago, unusually dry conditions similar to this season had driven desperate wildlife into unprecedented conflicts with humans. The regional bear population had experienced a particularly difficult season after late frost killed berry crops, forcing them to seek alternative food sources. Game wardens had relocated 27 problem bears from residential areas, and farmers had shot 5 bears caught damaging livestock or crops, legally but regretfully. During that difficult summer, Mike had discovered a bear had visited his apple storage shed 3 nights running, somehow opening the supposedly bear-proof latches. Rather than setting traps, he had installed motion-activated cameras. The resulting footage revealed a remarkably methodical female black bear who tested different approaches to the latch until finding an effective technique. What had impressed Mike wasn't just her persistence, but her problem-solving method. Trying one approach, assessing results, adjusting tactics. When he showed the footage to Dr. Chen at the Wildlife Center, she'd confirmed it demonstrated cognitive abilities rarely documented in wild bears. Mike had ultimately bear-proofed the shed more effectively, but he'd also begun leaving damaged apples in a designated area far from his buildings. Not directly feeding wildlife, which was illegal and unwise, but creating a buffer zone that reduced pressure to investigate human structures. This compromise had worked, and for the remainder of that season, bears had visited the apple pile but left his buildings untouched. He'd continued the practice during subsequent autumns, maintaining a delicate balance between appropriate boundaries and unnecessary conflict. As the fire popped and hissed in the cabin's hearth, Mike wondered if the bear he'd seen today was the same methodical female from 3 years ago. The time frame would fit, and something in her deliberate examination of him had suggested familiarity rather than first-time curiosity. If so, their previous indirect interaction might explain her unusual behavior, not tame or fearless, but perhaps recognizing him as a non-threatening figure in her territory. The notion offered little comfort as another heavy weight shifted against the cabin's exterior wall. Whatever animals circled outside, whether his analytical bear or another creature, remained wild, unpredictable, and potentially dangerous, especially if desperate for pre-hibernation calories. Mike added another log to the fire and settled in for what promised to be a long, vigilant night. As midnight approached and snow accumulated outside the cabin window, Mike found himself engaged in a peculiar psychological struggle. The rational portion of his mind maintained high alert, cataloging every sound that might indicate an animal attempting entry. His hand never strayed far from the axe propped against his chair, not his preferred solution, but his only defense if the situation deteriorated. Yet another part of him experienced a growing certainty that the presence outside meant him no harm. This intuition directly contradicted everything experience had taught him about wildlife behavior. Bears in late autumn, facing imminent hibernation, with insufficient fat reserves, were at their most unpredictable. They would investigate any potential food source with single-minded determination. The scratching and movement he'd heard intermittently for hours matched typical bear behavior. Investigation of structure edges, testing for weaknesses, periodic rest, followed by renewed interest. By all reasonable assessment, he faced a potentially dangerous situation requiring vigilance. Yet something felt different about this encounter. The movements outside lacked the frantic energy of a desperately hungry animal. Instead, they suggested methodical patrol, almost as if the bear were circling the cabin with purpose rather than seeking entry. During brief periods when wind subsided, Mike detected a pattern. Heaviest movement occurred on the side of the cabin facing the forest, with less activity near the door, facing the cleared area where his woodpile stood. "You're personifying," Mike muttered to himself, recognizing a tendency his wildlife biologist friends often criticized. Attributing human motivations to animal behavior was a common error among even experienced outdoorsmen. Animals operated on instinct and learned behavior, not abstract reasoning. A bear circling his cabin was hunting calories, not providing protection. The notion that formed in his mind that the bear might be positioning itself between the cabin and potential forest threats was fanciful thinking born of fatigue and isolation. Yet the feeling persisted, strong enough that Mike found himself relaxing despite the rational reasons for concern. The sensation reminded him of nights in his childhood when his father's hunting dogs had slept outside his window during thunderstorms. Their presence had created a sense of security that defied logical analysis. They couldn't prevent lightning strikes or shelter collapse, yet their alert vigilance had allowed his younger self to sleep peacefully through tumultuous weather. Mike's internal dialogue continued as he added the last log to the dwindling fire. "Bears don't guard humans," he reminded himself firmly. Yet even as he reinforced this certainty, other memories surfaced. Wildlife research papers describing bear behavior that defied simple categorization. A black bear in Tennessee that had led hikers to an injured cub, rather than fleeing with her offspring. A habituated bear in a Canadian park that had displayed apparent concern when its regular human observer appeared ill. Outlier behaviors, certainly, but documented by credible sources. The conflict between instinctive feeling and rational assessment became a tug-of-war in Mike's mind. His body demanded sleep after a day of physical labor, yet safety required wakefulness. His training and experience advised maintaining distance and wariness from wild predators, yet something deeper, perhaps the same instinct that had helped his ancestors survive in these mountains, suggested this particular animal presented no threat. As his thoughts circled without resolution, physical realities intruded. The fire had burned down to embers, and the cabin temperature was dropping precipitously. The thin, mouse-chewed blankets provided minimal insulation. Mike had kept moving for warmth, but exhaustion made this increasingly difficult. His rational mind calculated the risk of hypothermia against the unlikely but serious risk of a bear breaking through the window or door. Neither prospect was acceptable, yet he had limited options to address either concern. Outside, snow continued falling in thick, silent sheets. Occasional gusts drove icy particles through small gaps in the cabin's chinking, creating miniature snowdrifts on the floor. The deteriorating conditions created a new worry. If snowfall continued at this rate, the return journey tomorrow would become treacherous, perhaps even impossible until significant melting occurred. Being stranded for multiple days would transform his moderate discomfort into a genuinely dangerous situation given his limited supplies. In this moment of mounting concern, the irregular scratching outside suddenly stopped. The silence was so complete that Mike found himself holding his breath, straining to detect any sound beyond the faint hiss of dying embers. For nearly 5 minutes, nothing moved outside the cabin. Then a new sound emerged, the distinctive, woofing exhale of a bear settling into rest, followed by the subtle shifts of a heavy body adjusting position in snow. The realization struck Mike with surprising force. The bear had not left, but neither was it attempting entry. It appeared to have established a resting position against the cabin wall, a location that would benefit from residual heat escaping. The structure. More intriguingly, it had chosen the north wall, positioning itself directly between the cabin and the deeper forest beyond, the exact position a guard might choose. Mike's exhausted mind couldn't resolve the contradiction between what his knowledge told him must be coincidence and what his instinct suggested might be intentional. As the cabin grew colder and his body demanded rest, he made a decision that contradicted conventional wisdom but felt inexplicably right. Moving carefully, he arranged his makeshift bedding on the floor near the north wall, separated by mere inches of log construction from the massive predator outside, and allowed himself to drift towards sleep. His last conscious thought acknowledged the absurdity of finding comfort in the proximity of a wild bear. Yet as sleep claimed him, the psychological struggle resolved into a profound sense of security that defied rational explanation. Mike awakened to golden morning light streaming through the cabin's frosted window. For a moment, disorientation clouded his mind. The unfamiliar angle of sunlight, the profound cold that had settled into his joints, the rough wooden floor beneath his inadequate blankets. Then memory returned. The storm, the isolated cabin, and most remarkably, the bear that had apparently maintained position outside the north wall throughout the night. Silence greeted his first cautious movements. No scratching or shifting suggested the bear's continued presence. Standing required significant effort, his 58-year-old body protesting the night spent on hard planking in near-freezing temperatures. Once upright, Mike approached the window, expecting to see nothing but pristine snow and empty forest. The sight that greeted him instead halted his breath. Surrounding the cabin in a perfect circle, a path had been trampled in the foot-deep snow. The track's width and distinctive five-toed prints confirmed his midnight visitor's identity beyond question. A large black bear had indeed circled the cabin repeatedly throughout the night. But what astonished Mike wasn't confirmation of the bear's presence, but the deliberate pattern of its movement. The path formed an unbroken perimeter approximately 15 feet from the cabin walls, with no tracks leading toward or away from the structure, as if the bear had established a boundary and maintained it through hours of darkness. More remarkable still was what lay beyond this circular path. At 3 separate points along the perimeter, other tracks approached from the forest, smaller bear prints in one case, and what appeared to be coyote tracks in the others. In each instance, these incoming tracks stopped at the circled path, then diverted away from the cabin. The evidence suggested something unprecedented. Smaller predators had approached during the night, but retreated rather than crossing the larger bear's patrol route. Mike stood transfixed at the window, his mind struggling to process the implications. Wild bears didn't establish protective perimeters around human structures. They didn't sacrifice precious pre-hibernation rest to patrol through winter storms. Yet the physical evidence outside his cabin contradicted everything he knew about normal bear behavior. A sharp knock at the door nearly stopped his heart. "Mike, you in there?" Emma called, worried sick when you didn't come home. The familiar, gravelly voice belonged to Harold Jenkins, his closest neighbor and lifelong friend. At 76, Harold rarely ventured far from his own property, making his appearance here a 2-mile journey through fresh snow, all the more unexpected. Mike opened the door to find Harold leaning on his walking stick, breath clouding in the frigid morning air. Despite his age, Harold's eyes remained sharp beneath bushy white eyebrows, taking in Mike's disheveled appearance with a single glance. "Figured the storm caught you up here," Harold said by way of greeting. "Emma called around 9 last night. I told her you'd have sense enough to stay put, but she was still fretting. When I saw the tracks leading up here this morning, thought I'd better check. Tracks? Mike asked, suddenly alert. You saw the bear tracks? Harold's expression shifted subtly. Bear tracks all over, yes. But I was talking about your boot prints from yesterday, still visible under the snow in some places. He paused, studying Mike's face. You had company last night? Mike gestured toward the circular path visible from the doorway. Take a look for yourself. I've never seen anything like it. Harold stepped past Mike into the cabin, moving to the window for a better view. For several minutes, he said nothing, eyes tracking the path with the practiced assessment of someone who had spent 7 decades observing wildlife. Well, he finally said, voice deliberately neutral. That's something you don't see every day. It was here all night, Mike explained, circling, stopping occasionally. I thought it was trying to find a way in, but... He trailed off, not quite ready to voice his more improbable interpretation. Harold turned from the window, his weathered face unreadable. You ever hear the story my grandfather used to tell about the guardian bears? Mike had known Harold his entire life, had listened to countless hunting stories and wilderness experiences from the older man. But this reference was unfamiliar. Can't say that I have. Harold lowered himself into one of the wooden chairs, joints cracking audibly with the movement. Grandfather learned it from a Cherokee medicine man back in the 1920s, said certain bears aren't just animals, but protectors, spirits that take bear form to watch over people who've earned their respect. A self-conscious smile flickered across his face. Always thought it was just an old man's fancy, something to entertain children around campfires. Mike might have dismissed such talk from anyone else as superstition or folklore, but Harold had always been the most pragmatic, unsentimental person he knew. For him to even mention such a story suggested he found something genuinely unusual in the evidence outside. You think this bear was protecting me? Mike asked, feeling slightly foolish, voicing the question. Harold shrugged. I think something unusual happened here last night. Maybe this particular bear has had positive experiences with humans. Food left out, cubs rescued, who knows? Maybe it's developed behaviors we don't typically see. He paused. Or maybe there are still things in these mountains we don't fully understand, despite all our modern knowledge. This ambiguous response was typically Harold, acknowledging possibilities without committing to interpretations that couldn't be proven. But his next question caught Mike off guard. You leave food out for bears, Mike? The question carried no accusation, but Mike felt defensive nonetheless. Not directly. I dump damaged apples away from the buildings during harvest season. Creates a buffer zone. Harold nodded thoughtfully. Started that practice when? 3-4 years back? During that drought summer? 3 years, Mike confirmed, suddenly making connections Harold had apparently already considered. You think this could be the same bear that was getting into my apple shed back then? The one that figured out the latches? Could be. Harold's tone remained measured. Bears have excellent memories, especially for food sources. If you've been providing indirect benefits for several seasons, this one might associate you specifically with positive experiences. He cleared his throat. Of course, that doesn't explain why it would circle your cabin all night instead of continuing its foraging. The conversation paused as both men contemplated the mystery. Harold finally broke the silence with a practical suggestion. Whatever its reasons, the bear's behavior saved you considerable trouble last night. Those coyote tracks out there, that's the McFarland pack. They've been aggressive this season, even approached Ellie Peterson's back porch last week, with temperatures dropping and game scarce. They might have investigated your cabin pretty thoroughly if something hadn't discouraged them. This observation shifted Mike's perspective. He'd been so focused on the bear as a potential threat that he'd overlooked how its presence might have deterred other dangers. A man alone in a remote cabin, particularly one whose door and window weren't entirely secure, could present an attractive target to hungry predators. "So what now?" Mike asked, gathering his few belongings. Harold rose stiffly from his chair. "Now we get you home to Emma before she calls the sheriff. But first," he pulled a thermos from his coat pocket. "Hot coffee. Figured you'd need it." The simple gesture of practical kindness was pure Harold, and Mike accepted the thermos gratefully. As he sipped the scalding liquid, Harold moved to the doorway, studying the tracks once more. "One more thing," Harold said quietly. "My grandfather claimed people who'd been protected by guardian bears had responsibilities afterward. Said the protection created a bond that required reciprocation." "What kind of reciprocation?" Mike asked. Harold turned, his expression uncharacteristically solemn. "Protection in return, not just for that specific animal but for its kind. A balance maintained." He gestured toward the pristine wilderness beyond the trampled circle. "Something to consider given what's happening in the county these days." The cryptic statement hung between them as they prepared to depart. Mike knew Harold referred to the county commissioner's recent proposal to open previously protected forest areas to development. Controversial plans that had divided the community between economic interests and conservation concerns. Until this moment, Mike had remained neutral in the debate, reluctant to involve himself in political matters. Now, staring at the evidence of something extraordinary in the snow surrounding his cabin, he felt the first stirrings of obligation beyond his own property lines. As they stepped outside into the brilliant morning light, Mike carefully photographed the tracks with his cell phone, documenting the circular path and the diverted predator trails. He wasn't certain what these images might mean for his future actions, but instinct told him this evidence should be preserved. The two men began their journey down the mountain in companionable silence, each absorbed in private thoughts about boundaries between humans and wilderness, and the rare, precious moments when those boundaries temporarily dissolve. 3 days. After the incident at the cabin, Mike sat in his truck outside the Pinecrest Community Center, watching fellow residents file into the building for the county land use hearing. The parking lot contained the expected vehicles: logging company trucks with mud-spattered tires, shiny SUVs bearing environmental organization bumper stickers, and the practical sedans and pickups of local farmers and business owners. For 15 minutes, Mike had observed this procession without leaving his vehicle. Uncharacteristically hesitant to join a public meeting he would typically avoid altogether. The manila envelope on the passenger seat contained printouts of the photographs he'd taken outside the cabin, clear evidence of extraordinary animal behavior that defied conventional explanations. He'd shown these images to Emma, whose practical nature had initially suggested alternate interpretations before finally acknowledging the apparent intent behind the bear's movement patterns. He'd also emailed the photos to Dr. Chen at the Wildlife Center, whose professional response had been cautiously intrigued, requesting permission to share them with colleagues studying bear cognition and behavior. What Mike hadn't yet decided was whether these photos belonged in a public forum like today's hearing. The county commissioners were considering a proposal that would rezone 3,000 acres of previously protected forest for mixed-use development, primarily vacation homes, a small resort, and accompanying commercial infrastructure. Economically, many locals supported the plan for the jobs it would create. Environmentally, it represented significant habitat fragmentation in an area already pressured by climate change and human encroachment. Until the night in the cabin, Mike had maintained neutral distance from the controversy. His own property wouldn't be directly affected. and he generally avoided community disputes, preferring to focus on his own land management practices. But Harold's parting words about reciprocal protection had lingered, merging with his own sense of obligation following the inexplicable behavior of the bear who had apparently stood guard through a dangerous night. A sharp rap on his window interrupted his thoughts. Sam Rodriguez, the local Forest Service ranger, stood beside his truck, her official jacket zipped against the November chill. "Going in? Or just admiring the architecture?" she asked, with a hint of a smile when he rolled down the window. "Just gathering my thoughts," Mike replied, not quite ready to explain his reluctance. Sam nodded toward the envelope. "Those the bear photos Harold mentioned? He was pretty cryptic about them, but said you had something unusual to share." Mike shouldn't have been surprised that Harold had mentioned their experience. In small communities like Pinecrest, information traveled through established networks of friendship and family connection. Still, he felt a flicker of annoyance, that he'd lost control of his own narrative. "They might not mean what I initially thought," he hedged, protective of both the experience and his reputation for level-headedness. Sam's expression grew more serious. "Look, Mike, I don't know exactly what happened up at your cabin, but I do know we're facing a critical vote today. The commissioners are split, and testimony from respected community members like yourself could make a difference." She glanced toward the community center. "Especially testimony backed by concrete evidence of wildlife behavior that suggests greater intelligence and adaptation than developers are acknowledging." Her words crystallized the choice Mike faced. Entering that hearing meant stepping beyond his carefully maintained boundaries, moving from private land stewardship to public advocacy. It meant potential conflict with neighbors who supported development for valid economic reasons. It meant subjecting his extraordinary experience to public scrutiny, perhaps even ridicule from those who would dismiss the bear's behavior as coincidental or misinterpreted. Yet remaining silent felt increasingly impossible. If the bear had indeed intentionally protected him, whether through some unlikely learned behavior or something more mysterious, as Harold had hinted, then failing to speak for the forest that sustained such creatures would represent a profound betrayal. "The development plans include mitigation strategies," Mike said, giving voice to his internal conflict. "Wildlife corridors, conservation easements. Some would say that's a reasonable compromise." Sam's response was measured but direct. On paper, those strategies look sufficient. In practice, they rarely function as promised once construction begins. "You know how wildlife actually moves through these mountains, Mike. You know the difference between what looks workable on zoning maps and what animals actually need to survive." Her assessment aligned with his own doubts about the development proposal. The planned wildlife corridors were too narrow, too close to human activity to serve many sensitive species. The conservation easements protected impressive-looking acreage, but excluded critical water sources that animals relied upon during increasingly frequent drought periods. Mike's fingers tightened around the envelope containing his photographs. The bear that had circled his cabin, whether through learned association, extraordinary intelligence, or some deeper connection to humans, deserved an advocate who understood the true value of unspoiled wilderness. Perhaps more importantly, the incident had awakened Mike to his own unstated values, forcing him to acknowledge that his neutrality had been a form of privilege rather than wisdom. "The meeting starts in 5 minutes, Sam prompted gently. "Whatever you decide, it should be soon." Mike reached for his door handle, decision crystallizing into action. "I'll need about 2 minutes at the microphone. Those photos should be projected so everyone can see them clearly." Sam's relief was evident. "I'll make sure that happens." As they walked toward the community center together, Mike felt a peculiar mixture of trepidation and certainty. He was about to place himself publicly on one side of a divisive local issue, potentially alienating neighbors and business associates who supported development. Yet the alternative, remaining silent after what he'd experienced, suddenly seemed impossible. "Just curious," Sam said as they approached the entrance. "What? Changed your mind? You've avoided these meetings for years." Mike considered the question carefully, wanting his answer to reflect his genuine motivation rather than environmental talking points. "I've spent my life finding balance between human needs and wildlife preservation on my own land," he finally replied. "What I saw 3 nights ago suggested that relationship can be more profound than I ever imagined. If that's true, then balance needs advocates at moments like this." Sam nodded, seeming to understand the significance of this philosophical shift. As they entered the crowded meeting room, Mike noticed Harold Jenkins already seated near the front, his weathered face registering approval as he spotted the envelope in Mike's hand. Taking a seat in the middle row, not hiding at the back, but not positioning himself as a central figure either, Mike prepared to cross a threshold he hadn't anticipated just days earlier. The bear's extraordinary behavior had created an obligation he couldn't ignore, pushing him from private stewardship into public advocacy. Whatever the outcome of today's vote, Mike knew his relationship with both human community and wilderness had fundamentally changed. The community center hummed with tense conversation as the county commissioners arranged themselves behind a folding table at the front of the room. 5 individuals with expressions ranging from eagerness to resignation settled into their positions of authority, arranging papers and water bottles with practiced efficiency. Commissioner Margaret Wilkins, a silver-haired woman who had served 20 years on the board, rapped her gavel sharply against the wooden block, calling the meeting to order. The room gradually quieted as she outlined the evening's agenda, her tone suggesting this was procedural business rather than the deeply consequential decision it represented for the community. Mike found himself scanning the audience rather than focusing on the commissioner's introductory remarks. The seating arrangement in the room told its own story about local divisions. To his right sat a cluster of men and women in business attire, representatives from the development company and their local supporters. To his left, familiar faces from environmental organizations and the more conservation-minded farmers in the county. This physical separation reflected the ideological divide that had gradually formed in Pinecrest over the past decade as economic pressures clashed with environmental concerns. When public testimony began, speakers approached the microphone in alternating waves of support and opposition. A local contractor emphasized job creation potential. A retired biology teacher countered with concerns about watershed protection. The owner of a struggling hardware store spoke passionately about economic revitalization, while a young mother worried about increased traffic near the elementary school. Each speaker received polite attention, occasional murmurs of agreement from their ideological allies, and the commissioners practiced neutral expressions. As his turn approached, Mike felt unexpected nervousness. Public speaking had never been his strength, and the politically charged atmosphere amplified his discomfort. When Sam nudged his arm and whispered, "You're up next," he realized he'd been so focused on his racing thoughts that he'd missed the previous speaker entirely. "Michael Donovan, Willow Creek Farm," the clerk announced, and suddenly all eyes turned toward him. Mike approached the microphone with deliberate steps, clutching his envelope with tighter pressure than necessary. The walk felt longer than the actual 15 feet from his chair to the speaker's position. He cleared his throat, aware that his reputation as a moderate, uninvolved figure made his presence noteworthy to those familiar with local dynamics. "I've lived in these mountains my entire life," he began, his voice steadier than expected. "My family has farmed the same land for 3 generations. I generally stay out of public debates, believing each person should manage their own property as they see fit." He paused, allowing this establishment of his neutral credentials to register, but something happened 3 nights ago that I believe should inform this decision. Mike nodded toward Sam, who had positioned herself near the laptop controlling the room's projection system. She quickly opened the digital files he'd provided earlier, and suddenly the first image appeared on the screen behind the commissioners. The perfect circular path trampled in snow around his cabin, the distinctive bear tracks clearly visible. During Tuesday night's snowstorm, I was stranded at our family's hunting cabin, Mike continued, finding rhythm in the factual recounting. A large black bear appeared and circled the cabin repeatedly throughout the night. Not trying to break, not foraging, but creating and maintaining a deliberate perimeter. He advanced to the next image, showing where smaller predator tracks approached and diverted away from the circular path. These are coyote tracks, diverted from their approach to the cabin. And here, another image appeared. Smaller bear. Tracks similarly diverted. A murmur rippled through the audience. Mike had their attention now, though he sensed different reactions forming in different sections of the room. I've encountered wildlife my entire life. I've studied bear behavior as a land manager concerned with both crop protection and animal welfare. What happened that night defies conventional explanations. Mike took a steadying breath. This bear appeared to establish a protective boundary around a human shelter during dangerous weather conditions, deterring other predators from approaching. From the development supporters section came a dismissive chuckle. Mike recognized the source, Bradley Wilson from the County Economic Development Office, a man known for prioritizing growth metrics over environmental concerns. Mr. Donovan, Commissioner Wilkins interrupted gently, while this is certainly an interesting wildlife observation, could you clarify its relevance to the land use decision before us today? The question was fair and expected. Mike nodded. Acknowledgement. The relevance is this: we continue to discover complex behaviors and intelligence in wildlife that our development plans don't account for. The ecological impact studies conducted for this proposal were completed using standard wildlife behavior models that clearly don't capture the full reality of how these animals think and make decisions. Mike gestured toward the image, still projected on the screen. If bears in our forest demonstrate previously undocumented protective behaviors, what other crucial adaptations and capabilities might we be overlooking when we fragment their habitat? The proposed wildlife corridors are based on movement patterns documented through conventional tracking studies. But if bears and other animals have more complex decision-making processes than those studies recognize, we're building infrastructure based on incomplete data. Commissioner James Rodriguez leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. Are you suggesting we should delay development indefinitely because there might be animal behaviors we don't fully understand? The question wasn't hostile, but probed the practical implications of Mike's testimony. Before he could respond, Bradley Wilson spoke loudly from his seat. Or that we should make economic decisions based on fairy tales about guardian bears. A ripple of uncomfortable laughter spread through one section of the audience, while frowns appeared in another. The chairman tapped her gavel once, restoring order. Mike addressed both questions with careful consideration. I'm suggesting that when we encounter evidence that challenges our assumptions about wildlife behavior, we should reassess whether our mitigation strategies are sufficient. The current proposal designates corridors that are too narrow and excludes seasonal water sources that all local species depend on during drought. If bears are making complex decisions about territory and protection, they need more sophisticated habitat preservation than what's currently proposed. He withdrew a folded map from his envelope, a county survey map he'd marked with proposed adjustments to the development plan. I've outlined modifications that would preserve essential water access and widen corridors to account for predator-prey interactions. These changes would reduce the development footprint by roughly 12%, while significantly improving habitat preservation. This concrete suggestion shifted the room's energy. Mike wasn't simply opposing development, but offering a compromise grounded in specific land features. As the map was passed to the commissioners, conversations erupted throughout the room. Commissioner Wilkins studied the map with professional interest before addressing Mike again. These modifications would affect primarily the northern section of the proposed development. Are you aware that's where the resort's main lodge and premium home sites are planned due to the scenic views? I am, Mike acknowledged. Those locations were selected for human aesthetic preferences without considering their ecological significance. The ridgeline has particular importance for wildlife movement patterns, and the natural spring there provides water even during severe drought conditions. From the back of the room, a new voice entered the conversation. I'd like to address Mr. Donovan's proposal. Mike turned to see James Harrington, the lead developer, moving toward the front. Tall and expensively dressed, Harrington projected the confident authority of someone accustomed to shaping outcomes through sheer force of personality. While I appreciate local input, Harrington began once granted permission to speak, the suggestion to eliminate our premium locations would render the entire project economically unfeasible. Those specific home sites represent nearly 30% of our projected revenue. The views from that ridge command premium prices that subsidize the more affordable housing components. Mike felt momentum shifting away from his proposal as economic realities reasserted their dominance in the discussion. In this moment of apparent defeat, an unexpected ally emerged. Harold Jenkins raised his hand and was recognized by the chair. Though he'd lived in the community his entire life, few could remember Harold ever speaking at a public meeting. His reputation for wisdom and fairness gave his words particular weight as he stood, leaning on his walking stick. I was with Mike when he photographed those bear tracks, Harold stated, his gravelly voice carrying surprising authority. I've hunted these mountains for 70 years, and I've never seen animal behavior like what we documented. That bear knew exactly what it was doing. He paused, eyes moving deliberately from one commissioner to another. Our grandfathers understood something we've forgotten. There's value in these mountains beyond what can be counted in dollars. Harold turned slightly to address Harrington directly. You're planning to sell these homes based on the beauty and uniqueness of our mountains. That same uniqueness is what creates extraordinary wildlife, like the bear that guarded Mike's cabin. Destroy what makes this place special, and eventually, you've got nothing left worth selling. This philosophical perspective from the community's eldest respected voice created space for further dialogue. Commissioner Rodriguez suggested a compromise approach, maintaining the development's overall scale, but reconfiguring its footprint to accommodate Mike's ecological concerns. For the next 30 minutes, Mike found himself in an unexpected position, at the center of a detailed negotiation over conservation boundaries and development zones. His knowledge of local landscape features proved valuable as the discussion evolved from general principles to specific property lines and natural landmarks. Though Harrington remained skeptical, the commissioners appeared increasingly receptive to finding middle ground. When public testimony concluded, no formal decision had been reached, but Chair Wilkins announced that the final vote would be delayed 2 weeks to allow for assessment of the modified proposal. It wasn't victory, but it was far more influence than Mike had anticipated when he'd reluctantly entered the building hours earlier. As the meeting dispersed, community members approached Mike with varied reactions. Some farmers expressed appreciation for his balanced approach rather than outright opposition to development. Environmental advocates seemed pleased to have gained unexpected support from a respected local figure. Even some development supporters acknowledged the reasonableness of his specific proposals compared to more extreme positions they'd encountered. Harold appeared at Mike's side as the crowd thinned, a knowing look in his rheumy eyes. "So you've chosen sides, after all," he observed without judgment. Mike considered this assessment. Not sides exactly, just trying to honor what happened that night. Harold nodded slowly. "Sometimes honoring an experience is how we discover what we truly value." He gripped Mike's shoulder briefly before moving toward the exit, his slight limp more pronounced after sitting through the long meeting. As Mike gathered his materials, Harrington approached with the calculated affability of someone accustomed to converting adversaries into allies. "Interesting presentation, Donovan. I'm skeptical about interpreting animal behavior so creatively, but your land use suggestions have some merit. Perhaps we could discuss modifications that address your concerns without compromising our core business model." The olive branch was professionally extended, yet Mike detected the underlying calculation. Better to incorporate a moderate critic than allow him to become an opposition leader. Still, practical progress required practical compromises. "I'd be willing to walk the property lines with you," Mike offered. "Some of your objectives and mine might be compatible with the right adjustments." They exchanged contact information with business-like efficiency before Harrington departed, leaving Mike with mixed feelings about this new role he'd reluctantly assumed. Sam approached as he prepared to leave, her expression reflecting both approval and curiosity. "That went better than I expected," she acknowledged, "but I'm still wondering what really happened up at that cabin. Those photos show something remarkable, but you seemed almost reluctant to emphasize how extraordinary it was." Mike considered his response carefully. The full experience, the inexplicable sense of security he'd felt sleeping near the bear, the almost sentient quality of its behavior, felt too personal, too potentially mystical to share in a public forum. He'd presented the factual evidence while holding back the emotional truth that had actually motivated his actions. "Sometimes a mystery should remain mysterious," he finally replied. "I showed what could be documented. The rest is between me and whatever was circling in the snow that night." Sam accepted this boundary with professional respect. "Well, documented or not, something important happened. You've lived here your whole life without speaking at a county meeting. Now you're negotiating conservation easements with developers. That bear changed more than just your night in the cabin." The observation was perceptive and accurate. As Mike drove home through the darkened countryside, he reflected on how rapidly his relationship with both community and wilderness had evolved in the days since his night at the cabin. He had stepped from private stewardship into public advocacy, from philosophical appreciation of nature into active defense of specific acres and resources. Emma was waiting on the porch when he arrived home, wrapped in a thick cardigan against the evening chill. Her expression revealed she'd already heard about his unexpected public appearance. News traveled quickly in small communities, especially news involving someone breaking from established patterns. "Heard you made quite an impression," she said, as he climbed the steps. "Harold's wife called. Said you had the commissioners actually looking at maps instead of just checking their phones." Mike settled beside her on the porch swing, the familiar rhythm soothing after hours of tension. "Not sure how much difference it will make in the end, but at least they're considering alternatives." Emma leaned against his shoulder, her warmth. "Welcome in the crisp night air. You've never been one for public stands. Must have been some bear." The simple observation carried no judgment, just acknowledgement of how unusual his actions had been. For 35 years of marriage, Emma had respected his tendency toward private action rather than public advocacy. Her tacit approval of this deviation from pattern provided reassurance he hadn't realized he needed. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if that bear hadn't been there," Mike said quietly. "Not just the practical danger from coyotes or the cold, but what I would have missed understanding about this place we've lived our entire lives." Emma considered this with her characteristic thoughtfulness. Maybe that's what Harold meant about reciprocal protection. The bear showed you something worth defending, so now you're doing exactly that. The observation distilled complex philosophical questions into practical relationship, action and response, protection offered and returned. As they sat in comfortable silence, Mike found himself scanning the darkened tree line at the edge of their property. Somewhere in the shadows beyond their porch light, the wilderness continued its ancient rhythms. Perhaps within that darkness, a bear with unusual intelligence continued its own journey, unaware of how profoundly their brief intersection had altered a human life. "Do you think you'll see it again?" Emma asked, following his gaze toward the forest. Mike considered the question seriously. Hard to say. Bears don't typically revisit human encounters unless food is involved. He paused, remembering the deliberate assessment in the bear's gaze during their first meeting. But this one seemed to recognize something. Not just me specifically, but maybe something about how we've managed this land over the years. The Bill notion wasn't scientific, yet it resonated with what he'd experienced, a sense of recognition that transcended typical animal awareness. As they prepared to go inside, a distant sound drifted from the darkened forest, the distinctive huffing of a bear moving through underbrush. Not approaching, not retreating, just passing through its territory with the confidence of a creature at home in its world. Emma squeezed his hand gently. "Sounds like your friend agrees with your testimony." Mike smiled at the fanciful interpretation while acknowledging the comfort it provided. Whether coincidence or confirmation, the familiar sound reinforced his sense of having honored something important through his uncharacteristic public engagement. As they entered their home together, he carried a new understanding of his place in the complex web of community and wilderness, not just a property owner or neutral observer, but an active participant in shaping his environment's future. The struggle. 2 weeks after the county meeting, Mike found himself in an unexpected position, standing beside James Harrington at the edge of a steep ravine, engaged in tense negotiation over precise boundary lines for conservation easements. Late November wind cut through their jackets as they consulted maps spread across the hood of Mike's truck, their breath creating ephemeral clouds in the frigid air. What had begun as cautious cooperation had deteriorated into frustrating stalemate over the past 10 days, with each party growing increasingly entrenched in their position. "This section is non-negotiable," Harrington insisted, tapping a manicured finger against the map where a natural spring emerged from limestone formations. "The water feature is essential for the recreational area we've planned. The amenity value alone represents millions in property valuation." Mike suppressed his rising frustration, recognizing the fundamental disconnect in their perspectives. That spring isn't just a water feature, it's the primary water source for wildlife across 5 square miles during drought conditions. The geological formations make it one of the few springs that doesn't run dry during extended dry periods. Harrington's expression conveyed professional patience stretched thin. "Our environmental consultants have identified 3 alternative water sources within reasonable distance. The impact assessment concluded wildlife would adapt their movement patterns." "Your consultant spent 6 days here in perfect weather conditions," Mike countered. "I've watched animals during drought years for decades. Those alternative sources you're citing dried up completely during the last 3 significant droughts." The fundamental conflict had become increasingly clear through their negotiations. Harrington viewed land as a collection of assets to be balanced and traded: scenic views, water features, development potential, while Mike understood it as an interconnected living system where certain elements couldn't be substituted or relocated without cascading consequences. Their philosophical divide was complicated by practical political realities. The county commissioners had responded to the modified proposals with cautious interest, but required agreement between major stakeholders before proceeding with formal adjustments. Mike's unexpected alliance with several conservation-minded community members had created sufficient political pressure to force negotiation, but not enough to unilaterally impose solutions. Harrington closed his leather portfolio with deliberate finality. "I've already conceded significant compromises on the wildlife. Corridors and buffer zones, the spring and surrounding acreage remain essential to our development model. I suggest you reconsider your position before Wednesday's vote if you want any modifications to the original plan." The implied ultimatum hung in the cold air between them. Mike recognized the negotiating tactic for what it was: an attempt to pressure him into accepting partial victories rather than continued advocacy for comprehensive changes. The strategy might have worked with professional environmental organizations accustomed to incremental gains, but Mike's motivation stemmed from something more personal than political calculation. As Harrington departed in his polished SUV, Mike remained beside his truck, studying the landscape with growing concern. The negotiations had consumed his attention for days, leaving little time for regular farm operations during a critical pre-winter period. Emma had shouldered additional responsibilities without complaint, but the approaching frost would require all hands for the final harvest of late-season crops. His advocacy was extracting practical costs from his family and livelihood. More troubling still was the growing division within the community. What had begun as his personal response to an extraordinary experience had evolved into a symbolic battle between development and conservation interests. Neighbors who had maintained friendly relations despite different philosophical outlooks now found themselves aligned with opposing camps. Mike's position as a moderate voice had initially fostered dialogue, but increasingly became a target for frustration from both extremes. The developers' supporters viewed him as an obstacle to economic opportunity, while hardcore environmental activists criticized his willingness to compromise on certain aspects of the development plan. At the local diner 3 days earlier, conversations had halted awkwardly when he entered, suggesting his presence now triggered political calculations rather than neighborly welcome. Driving home along familiar back roads, Mike noticed a newly erected sign on the Jenkins property. "Jobs, not bears," emblazoned in bright red letters. The slogan represented the growing characterization of his position as anti-development rather than pro-responsible planning. Harold hadn't endorsed this simplistic framing, but his grandson Billy, unemployed since the sawmill closure, clearly had stronger opinions about economic priorities. At the farm, additional complications awaited. Emma met him at the door with concern etched in her features. "Dr. Chen called twice, said it's important you contact her today." Mike's relationship with the wildlife veterinarian had evolved significantly since sharing his bear photographs. Initially skeptical, Dr. Chen had become increasingly interested in the documentation of unusual bear behavior, ultimately requesting permission to include the images in a research presentation at a regional wildlife management conference. What had begun as a personal experience had gradually entered scientific discourse. "Did she say what it's about?" Mike asked, shedding his jacket. "She mentioned reports of a bear matching your description near the Stevenson property, apparently showing unusual behavior toward humans again." The information triggered both concern and validation. Additional instances of extraordinary behavior would strengthen his argument about re-evaluating wildlife management assumptions, yet also raised worries about the bear's safety as it continued interactions with humans who might not interpret its actions correctly. Mike's call to Dr. Chen confirmed his concerns. A large female black bear had approached the Stevensons' 9-year-old son while he collected kindling near their rural property. Instead of displaying typical avoidance or aggressive protection of territory, the bear had apparently shepherded the boy away from an area where survey stakes had recently been placed for preliminary development work. Precisely the section Mike had been negotiating to protect as expanded wildlife corridor. The boy wasn't harmed, Mike confirmed, picturing the Stevenson child, a quiet boy who sometimes helped with apple picking during harvest season. Not physically, Dr. Chen clarified. Frightened by the experience naturally, but he described the bear as pushing him back toward his house without growling or charging. His father reported seeing the bear retreat once the child reached their yard. The account aligned remarkably with Mike's own experience, a bear demonstrating protective rather than aggressive behavior, apparently making sophisticated distinctions between threatening and non-threatening human activities. While scientifically fascinating, the development raised immediate practical concerns. Have the Stevensons reported this to wildlife authorities? Mike asked. Not yet. They called me first because they'd heard about your experience from community discussions. But if word spreads about a bear approaching a child, she didn't need to complete the thought. Despite the non-aggressive nature of the interaction, many parents would demand removal of any bear that approached children. Wildlife management protocols typically err strongly on the side of human safety, often resulting in relocation or even euthanasia for bears that demonstrate unusual interest in human activities. I'll speak with them directly, Mike decided. See if we can document exactly what happened before rumors transform the story. Dr. Chen's relief was audible. That would be helpful. I've offered to come out tomorrow to check for any identifiable tracks or markings. If it's the same bear, establishing a pattern of non-aggressive unusual behavior might help protect it from overreaction. After hanging up, Mike shared the development with Emma, whose practical mind immediately identified the broader implications. This complicates your negotiations considerably. If the story becomes public, development supporters will use it to argue that bears are becoming dangerously habituated to humans and need to be removed for safety. Her assessment aligned with Mike's own concern. The delicate balance he'd been negotiating could easily collapse if the narrative shifted from intelligent wildlife deserving protection to dangerous predators threatening children. The timing couldn't be worse with the commissioner's vote. Approaching in just 2 days, Mike's visit to the Stevenson farm that evening confirmed his worries. Though Jason Stevenson described his son's experience in measured terms, emphasizing the non-aggressive nature of the encounter, his wife Rachel's perspective reflected more conventional fears. I don't care how gentle it was, she insisted, as they sat at their kitchen table. A wild bear approached my child. What happens next time if it decides he's a threat? Or if a different bear, without this supposed special behavior, encounters him? Her concern was entirely reasonable from a parent's perspective, and Mike couldn't dismiss it, even as he tried to accurately document the encounter. The conversation grew increasingly tense until young Tyler Stevenson himself provided unexpected clarity. It wasn't being mean, the boy interjected from the doorway where he'd been quietly listening. It stood like this, he demonstrated by placing himself sideways, arms slightly extended, and walked toward me without looking at me directly, like it was showing me which way to go without being scary. The description matched precisely what ethologists would recognize as non-threatening herding behavior rather than predatory or aggressive movement. Mike asked several careful questions about the bear's specific body language, which Tyler answered with the detailed observation sometimes found in quieter children. The boy's account suggested sophisticated behavioral choices that aligned remarkably with Mike's own experience. Despite this clarification, Rachel Stevenson remained understandably concerned about her son's safety. I appreciate that this might be unusual behavior worth studying, but my priority has to be protecting my family. If that means reporting this officially so the bear is relocated, that's what we'll do. Mike recognized the conversation had reached a critical juncture. His advocacy for the bear needed to acknowledge legitimate human safety concerns while preventing unnecessary harm to an animal demonstrating extraordinary characteristics. What if we implement immediate protective measures while documenting the behavior properly? He suggested. I can help install better fencing around your immediate yard area today, and Dr. Chen wants to place trail cameras to capture any further activity. If there's any hint of actual aggression, we contact authorities immediately. But if this is truly unusual, non-threatening behavior, we have scientific documentation rather than just anecdotal reports. The compromise approach addressed immediate safety concerns while creating space for more nuanced understanding. After further discussion, the Stevensons tentatively agreed to delay official reporting for 72 hours while implementing enhanced safety protocols and documentation efforts. Driving home in darkness, Mike felt the weight of rapidly multiplying responsibilities. He'd committed several days of labor to helping the Stevensons with safety improvements, time he couldn't spare from either farm operations or preparation for the crucial commissioner's vote. The coordinated documentation effort with Dr. Chen would require additional hours, reviewing footage and cataloging observations. Meanwhile, Harrington's ultimatum about the spring property loomed, with no clear path to resolution. These mounting pressures converged upon returning home, where an official-looking envelope awaited on the kitchen table. The County Planning Commission had responded to a technical challenge filed by the development company, rejecting Mike's claim about seasonal water source significance due to insufficient longitudinal data. The formal language masked a simple reality. His decades of personal observation carried less weight than the developers' professionally produced environmental impact statements, despite their limited time frame and scope. Emma found him at the kitchen table hours later, surrounded by maps, scientific journals, and hastily scrawled notes, a farmer turned activist trying to master technical language and regulatory frameworks that had never previously entered his world. She placed a mug of coffee beside his elbow, studying his exhausted expression with concern. "You can't solve everything at once," she observed gently. "Maybe it's time to prioritize what matters most." Her pragmatic suggestion forced Mike to confront the fundamental question he'd been avoiding. What had begun as honoring an extraordinary personal experience had expanded into battles on multiple fronts: ecological, political, and now involving direct wildlife protection. The mounting responsibilities threatened to overwhelm his capacity, potentially undermining effectiveness in all areas. "I'm not sure what to let go," he admitted. "The commissioner's vote affects thousands of acres, but this immediate situation with the bear might be life or death for the exact animal that helped me." Emma considered this with characteristic thoughtfulness. When you can't address everything, focus on what only you can do. Others can argue policy points at the commission meeting. No one else has your personal connection to this particular bear situation. Her insight crystallized Mike's dilemma into clearer perspective. His testimony about unusual bear behavior carried unique weight because of his direct experience, reputation for careful observation, and decades of credibility within the community. Environmental organizations had professional advocates who could address technical aspects of the development proposal, but no one else could speak with his authority about the specific bear that had demonstrated extraordinary behavior. This realization prompted a difficult decision. The following morning, Mike contacted Sam Rodriguez to explain his pivot in strategy. Rather than continuing direct negotiations with Harrington, he would focus on documenting and protecting the bear that had shown unusual behavior, creating a compelling case study that might influence broader wildlife management approaches. Sam's initial disappointment transitioned to strategic recalibration. If you can definitively demonstrate this is the same bear showing repeated intelligent interaction with humans, that creates a much stronger argument for expanded protection than theoretical debates about corridor width. Their conversation outlined a coordinated approach. Sam would represent the technical conservation arguments at the commissioner's vote, while Mike focused on working with Dr. Chen to document the bear's behavior pattern. This collaboration would extend to establishing a temporary observation station near the Stevenson property, where recent activity suggested the bear might return. As they implemented this plan over the next 48 hours, additional challenges emerged. Word of the bear's interaction with Tyler Stevenson had spread through community networks despite efforts at discretion. Local media requested interviews, which Mike and the Stevensons declined to prevent sensationalized coverage. More concerning were reports of self-appointed protection patrols by several hunting enthusiasts who viewed the bear's behavior as dangerous habituation requiring intervention. Dr. Chen's arrival with sophisticated tracking and documentation equipment helped establish scientific legitimacy for their efforts, but also attracted additional attention. When Mike, Dr. Chen, and Sam Rodriguez gathered at the Stevenson property to install trail cameras, an impromptu neighborhood meeting formed in the driveway, with local residents expressing varied perspectives on wildlife management and development priorities. "This isn't just about one bear," elderly Mrs. Peterson declared firmly. "It's about whether we respect anything that doesn't generate profit." Her statement captured the evolving nature of the discussion, from specific animal behavior to fundamental values regarding development and conservation. What had begun as Mike's personal experience was transforming into a community referendum on relationship with wilderness. The commissioner's vote proceeded without Mike's direct participation, resulting in partial victory, approval of the development with modified boundaries that incorporated approximately 60% of his proposed changes. The spring remained within development jurisdiction, but with restricted usage requirements that provided some protection for wildlife access. The outcome represented meaningful improvement over the original plan, but fell short of the comprehensive approach Mike had advocated. This mixed result might have felt defeating 2 weeks earlier, but Mike's perspective had evolved through his struggles on multiple fronts. The immediate protection of the bear that had demonstrated extraordinary behavior had become his priority, representing both personal obligation and symbolic importance. If a wild creature could transcend instinctive responses to offer protection to humans, perhaps humans could reciprocate by recognizing and preserving intelligence that defied conventional understanding of wildlife behavior. The observation station, established near the Stevenson property, quickly generated valuable documentation. Trail cameras captured nighttime images of a large female bear investigating the newly installed protective fencing, not attempting to breach it, but seemingly assessing its purpose. More remarkably, thermal imaging showed the same bear apparently patrolling the property perimeter before retreating toward the contested spring area near dawn. Dr. Chen's professional assessment provided scientific context for these observations. What we're seeing suggests territorial behavior that incorporates human structures into protective patterns. It's not unprecedented in habituated bears, but the apparent intentionality and absence of food-seeking behavior make this case exceptional. Her careful scientific language translated to a profound conclusion. This bear was demonstrating cognitive processes and decision-making that challenged conventional wildlife management frameworks. As documentation accumulated over several days, a compelling case study emerged that Dr. Chen prepared for both academic presentation and practical policy advocacy. On the sixth night of observation, their documentation efforts faced unexpected interruption. Mike arrived at the observation station shortly after midnight for his monitoring shift to find equipment damaged and a spray-painted message on the equipment case. "Bears or people, choose one." The vandalism represented escalating community tension as battle lines hardened between development supporters and conservation advocates. What had begun as Mike's personal experience had become a proxy conflict for broader disagreements about economic development, property rights, and environmental values. The polarization threatened both their immediate documentation efforts and longer-term prospects for community consensus. As Mike assessed the damage to their equipment, a distinctive sound from the forest edge caught his attention: the huffing breath of a bear moving purposefully through undergrowth. His initial reaction was concern. The vandals might still be nearby, creating potential for dangerous confrontation between humans and wildlife. He moved quickly to retrieve the functioning camera equipment, intending to withdraw from potential conflict. Before he could complete this precautionary retreat, the female bear emerged into the small clearing where their observation station had been established. Even in dim moonlight, Mike recognized her distinctive size and movement pattern. Unmistakably the same animal that had circled his cabin during the snowstorm. For several seconds, neither moved, repeating their first encounter weeks earlier with the same careful mutual assessment. What happened next would later be partially captured by the single functioning camera remaining at the site. The bear approached to within 15 feet of Mike, closer than any wild black bear would typically venture to a human without food motivation. Instead of displaying typical curiosity or investigation, she made a soft moaning sound and turned her head deliberately toward a dense thicket approximately 30 yards away, then back to Mike, repeating this gesture 3 times. The clear, communicative intent in this behavior overrode Mike's initial caution. "You want me to see something," he said quietly, receiving an immediate huffing response that seemed to confirm his interpretation. With carefully measured movements, Mike activated the flashlight on his phone and began moving in the indicated direction, maintaining awareness of the bear's position behind him. What he discovered in the thicket explained the bear's unusual behavior. A crude wire snare had been installed, apparently by the same individuals who had vandalized their equipment. The illegal trap had been concealed with sufficient skill to endanger any animal investigating the area, including the bear that had seemingly detected its presence. Mike's discovery of the snare created both immediate practical concerns and profound philosophical questions. The practical issue demanded contacting wildlife authorities to remove the illegal trap and investigate its placement. The philosophical dimension was more complex. A wild bear had apparently recognized a hidden threat and deliberately communicated its presence to a human with whom it had prior positive interaction. This incident transformed their documentation from academic interest to urgent conservation case. The deliberate attempt to harm the bear they were studying demonstrated both the animal's extraordinary value and the threat posed by hardening community divisions. Dr. Chen's careful scientific documentation acquired new purpose, not just advancing understanding of bear cognition, but protecting a specific animal, demonstrating remarkable characteristics. The following morning, as wildlife officers removed the snare and collected evidence about its placement, Mike found himself explaining the bear's communicative behavior to increasingly skeptical authorities. Despite trail camera footage showing Portions of the interaction, the officer's expressions reflected professional doubt about interpretations that stretched beyond conventional wildlife behavior patterns. "We understand your concern for this particular animal," the lead officer stated diplomatically, "but interpretation of behavior is subjective. What appears to be communication might be coincidental movement patterns." Dr. Chen intervened with the practiced authority of her scientific credentials. "What we're documenting here isn't isolated or anecdotal. It represents multiple instances of behavior that demonstrates sophisticated assessment and decision-making beyond typical patterns." The exchange highlighted the fundamental challenge in their advocacy, bridging the gap between established wildlife management frameworks and emerging understanding of animal cognition that suggested greater complexity than previously acknowledged. Scientific progress often advances through exactly such tensions between existing models and anomalous observations that don't fit established paradigms. As the investigation into the illegal snare continued, community polarization intensified. Local media coverage simplified complex wildlife management questions into divisive headlines that reinforced existing positions rather than fostering nuanced understanding. Development supporters characterized conservation efforts as prioritizing animals over human economic needs, while environmental advocates portrayed developers as sacrificing irreplaceable natural resources for short-term profit. Mike found himself increasingly uncomfortable with how both sides portrayed the situation. Neither extreme position captured the delicate balance he sought: responsible development that preserved crucial habitat features while allowing economic opportunities that many community members genuinely needed. More concerning was how the bear he hoped to protect had become more symbol than actual living creature in these discussions, with both sides projecting their values onto an animal whose actual survival hung in the balance. As Mike drove home from another contentious community meeting, his headlights caught a familiar silhouette at the forest edge bordering his property, the distinctive form of F217, the bear whose remarkable behavior had initiated this entire journey. She stood motionless at the tree line, her attention focused entirely on Mike's approaching vehicle rather than showing typical avoidance behavior. The unusual encounter, happening so close to his home, sent a chill of concern through him. Emma was waiting on the porch when he pulled up, her expression unusually grave. "Tyler Stevenson's father called while you were out. They found unusual tracks circling their house this morning. Bear tracks. Rachel is terrified." The information transformed Mike's concern into genuine alarm. F217 had previously demonstrated extraordinary behavior, but deliberate approach to human dwellings represented potentially dangerous escalation that could trigger immediate removal, regardless of their advocacy efforts. If protection was to remain viable, they needed to understand this behavioral change before it resulted in emergency intervention. "I'll check it first thing tomorrow," Mike promised, though sleep would prove elusive as he contemplated potential explanations and implications. Throughout the night, dawn found Mike and Dr. Chen carefully examining the tracks surrounding the Stevenson home. The distinctive pattern was unmistakable, a complete circle around the house, methodically maintained at consistent distance from the walls, identical to what Mike had documented at his cabin during the snowstorm months earlier. "This isn't random movement," Dr. Chen acknowledged, her scientific caution yielding to undeniable evidence. "The deliberate patterning suggests intentional perimeter maintenance rather than typical food-seeking or exploratory behavior." What made the situation particularly perplexing was the absence of obvious environmental trigger. No storm had threatened the Stevensons, no predators had been reported in the area, and the family reported nothing unusual except the mysterious tracks themselves. Whatever had motivated F2117's apparent protective behavior remained unclear despite the unmistakable evidence of its occurrence. As they completed documentation, Rachel Stevenson approached with visible anxiety. "The rangers said we should report any bear activity immediately. They mentioned possible relocation if it continues." Approaching Holmes. Her concern was entirely reasonable from a parent's perspective. Yet Mike recognized the potential consequences for F217 if official intervention proceeded based on incomplete understanding. Removal would almost certainly mean relocation to distant wilderness or even euthanasia, if the bear was classified as habituated to human proximity despite no evidence of aggression or food conditioning. "Before making that call," Mike suggested carefully, "I'd like to try understanding what might be triggering this behavior. Bears don't typically approach human dwellings without specific motivation, usually food attractants or perceived threats." Rachel's expression reflected skepticism, but she reluctantly agreed to temporary delay in official reporting. "One day, if you can't provide a reasonable explanation by tomorrow, we're contacting wildlife authorities." This conditional reprieve created urgent timeline for investigation that might determine F207's fate. As Mike and Dr. Chen departed the Stevenson property, they compared observations and potential hypotheses, seeking explanation that might justify protective intervention rather than removal. "The behavioral consistency between your cabin incident and this perimeter establishment suggests similar motivation," Dr. Chen observed. "During your encounter, the bear appeared to be responding to potential threats approaching your location during vulnerable conditions. The question becomes what similar vulnerability might exist at the Stevenson residence." The parallel struck Mike forcefully. During his cabin experience, he had been isolated, vulnerable to environmental threats during severe weather. What comparable vulnerability might explain protective behavior around an occupied family home during mild weather conditions? The answer emerged when they returned to review recent monitoring data from cameras placed throughout the area as part of their research program. Images captured 3 days earlier showed F217 moving through forest near the Stevenson property, accompanied by 2 small cubs, evidence of successful reproduction that transformed their understanding of her behavior entirely. "New mother bears are hypersensitive to potential threats," Dr. Chen explained, scientific excitement evident despite her professional restraint. "The presence of cubs explains heightened territorial behavior, but not specifically directed protective patterns around human dwellings." Their breakthrough came when Sam Rodriguez contributed crucial contextual information after reviewing ranger incident reports. "There's been increased mountain lion activity reported in this precise area. 2 confirmed sightings last week, including one less than a mile from the Stevenson property." This ecological context suddenly illuminated F217's behavior through entirely different framework. Mountain lions represented significant threat to bear cubs, with documented predation of young bears when opportunity presented. A mother bear with vulnerable offspring might perceive cougar presence as sufficient danger to establish protective territories. But why, specifically, around human dwellings? Harold Jenkins provided final perspective that completed their understanding. When consulted about historical wildlife interactions in the region, his decades of observation offered crucial insight. Mountain lions generally avoid areas with consistent human activity. A smart bear might recognize that human structures represent relative safety from cougar predation, especially if she's had positive or neutral experiences with those specific humans. This explanation synthesized their accumulated observations into coherent hypothesis. F217, now with vulnerable cubs to protect, was utilizing human structures as strategic buffer against mountain lion threat. establishing protective perimeters specifically around dwellings associated with humans she had previously encountered without negative outcomes. The behavior represented sophisticated risk assessment and adaptation rather than problematic habituation or aggression. Armed with this ecological explanation, Mike returned to the Stevenson family, offering perspective that transformed their understanding of the situation. Rather than random or threatening behavior, the bear's actions could be interpreted as strategic utilization of existing landscape features, including human presence, to protect vulnerable offspring. "She's not targeting your home specifically," Mike explained. "She's recognizing that mountain lions typically avoid human activity areas. By establishing territory that includes your home within protected perimeter, she's creating safer space for her cubs using existing landscape features, including human presence, as strategic resources." Though initially skeptical, Rachel Stevenson found the explanation increasingly persuasive as evidence was presented. The identification of cubs through camera footage, documented mountain lion activity, and historical understanding of predator interactions created comprehensive framework that made sense of otherwise inexplicable behavior. "So, she's not interested in us at all?" Tyler asked, his initial fear gradually transforming into fascination. "She's just using our house as a sort of bear safety zone?" "Exactly," Dr. Chen confirmed, maintaining scientific precision while addressing the boy's understanding. "She's demonstrating remarkable adaptation by incorporating human structures into her protection strategy without actual dependence on human interaction. It's indirect utilization rather than habituation." This reframing transformed the Stevensons' perception from fear of targeting to appreciation of incidental inclusion in natural protective strategy. More importantly, it provided legitimate alternative to removal by explaining unusual behavior through ecological context rather than problematic habituation. When rangers eventually reviewed their documentation, the presence of cubs and documented predator activity created sufficient justification for monitoring rather than immediate intervention. News of F217's cubs spread rapidly through community networks, transforming public discourse about the guardian bear in unexpected ways. The presence of offspring humanized the animal for many who had previously perceived only abstract threat or symbolic representation, creating emotional connection that transcended ideological positioning. Conservation advocates gained persuasive narrative about protecting mother and cubs, while development supporters found difficulty maintaining opposition to specific protection measures for sympathetic family unit. Commissioner Wilson, previously advocate for removal authorization, demonstrated remarkable evolution in perspective during subsequent public meeting. "Having reviewed comprehensive documentation about this specific situation, I believe standard removal would be inappropriate response to what appears to be natural protective behavior without aggressive intent toward humans. The presence of cubs creates different management context that justifies modified approach." This public reassessment from previously oppositional figure created space for collaborative solution that transcended earlier polarized positioning. Rather than emergency removal or unrestricted protection, community leadership developed balanced monitoring program that included education components, appropriate safety protocols, and designated observation opportunities that transformed potential conflict into community asset. Most remarkably, the Stevenson family became unexpected advocates for coexistence approach after their initial fear transformed into appreciation through better understanding. Rachel Stevenson's testimony during County Commission hearing carried particular weight, given her initial opposition and legitimate parental concerns. "Once we understood what was actually happening, we realized this wasn't threat, but opportunity," she explained to attentive commissioners. My son has learned more about wildlife behavior and ecology through this experience than any classroom could provide. With proper education and safety protocols, we've transformed potential danger into valuable connection with the natural world our community claims to value. This perspective from previously fearful parent created powerful counter-narrative to simplistic safety concerns that had dominated earlier discussions. The modified approach that emerged included designated wildlife observation areas where community members could safely view F217 and her cubs from appropriate distance. Educational programs that expanded ecological understanding beyond simplified. Threat narratives and monitoring protocols that protected both human safety and wildlife welfare through evidence-based management rather than reactive fear response. As implementation of this balanced approach proceeded through spring and summer months, F217 and her cubs became unlikely community icons, not through inappropriate habituation or artificial attraction, but through respectful distance observation that allowed appreciation of natural behavior while maintaining appropriate boundaries between wild creatures and human observers. Most significantly, the experience catalyzed community reassessment of development plans through ecological perspective that transcended previous economic versus environment positioning. When construction eventually proceeded under modified design that incorporated legitimate wildlife corridors, preserved crucial habitat features, and established permanent observation areas, the compromise represented genuine balance between developmental needs and conservation values rather than zero-sum competition between opposed interests. For Mike personally, the journey that had begun with inexplicable night at remote cabin culminated in transformed relationship with both human community and surrounding wilderness. His previously private conservation values had evolved into public engagement that acknowledged legitimate competing priorities while advocating for balanced approaches based on evidence rather than ideological positioning. This matured perspective recognized complexity beyond simplistic categorization, seeking sustainable integration rather than artificial separation between human activity and natural systems. On autumn evening, approximately 1 year after their initial extraordinary encounter, Mike found himself approaching the cabin where transformative experience had occurred during snowstorm night. Seasonal maintenance required periodic attention to the simple structure his grandfather had constructed generations earlier, creating practical reason for visiting location that carried profound personal significance beyond physical characteristics. As he completed necessary repairs before winter weather arrived, movement at Forest Edge caught his attention. Distinctive silhouette immediately recognizable despite gathering dusk. F217 stood partially visible among young pine growth, with smaller forms moving nearby that represented her maturing cubs, now approaching juvenile independence after months of maternal protection and education. For several minutes, silent mutual observation continued without movement from either participant. No practical threat or resource need motivated their respective presence. Simply coincidental intersection at location carrying shared significance through previous extraordinary interaction. The distance maintained between them represented appropriate boundary between wild creatures and human observer. Neither inappropriate habituation nor fearful avoidance, but mutual acknowledgement of legitimate coexistence within shared landscape. Without dramatic gesture or anthropomorphic interaction that might suggest inappropriate relationship with wild creatures, the moment nevertheless carried profound significance through mutual recognition across species boundaries. F217's behavior suggested recognition of specific human individual distinct from generalized human presence, while Mike's response acknowledged individual animal identity beyond categorical species membership. As darkness settled more fully across, The mountain landscape. The bear family retreated silently into forest depth, returning to wild existence appropriate to their nature. Mike completed final maintenance tasks before beginning journey toward farmhouse, where Emma waited, carrying modified understanding of relationship between human community and wilderness that had emerged through extraordinary sequence of events. The transformed perspective acknowledged both separation and connection. Appropriate boundaries between wild creatures and human activity, alongside recognition of shared landscape requiring mutual accommodation. No simplistic resolution had emerged to complex challenges of balancing human needs with wildlife preservation. Yet practical path forward had developed through evidence-based assessment, respectful engagement across differing priorities, and creative problem-solving beyond zero-sum positioning. As seasons continued their eternal cycle through mountain landscape, F217 and her growing cubs maintained presence within transformed territory that accommodated both human development and wildlife preservation through negotiated compromise. Their continued existence represented neither complete victory for preservation nor unrestricted development, but rather practical demonstration that meaningful balance remained possible when approached through genuine recognition of legitimate value in both human prosperity and ecological integrity. This balance found physical manifestation in landscape features that emerged through collaborative planning, wildlife corridors connecting preserved habitat sections, observation areas allowing appropriate appreciation without disruption, and modified development that provided needed economic opportunity while maintaining ecological function, critical to sustainable coexistence. The integrated approach represented neither dominance nor separation, but mutual accommodation within shared territory that acknowledged both distinction and connection. Perhaps most significantly, their story entered community narrative as reference point for approaching inevitable future conflicts between development pressure and preservation needs. When subsequent disputes arose regarding appropriate balance between human activity and wildlife protection, participants increasingly referenced their shared experience with the guardian bear as demonstration that creative solutions remained possible beyond entrenched opposition or simplistic prioritization of single values. This cultural legacy transcended scientific documentation or policy precedent, creating sustained influence through transformed community self-understanding and approach to inevitable tensions between competing legitimate priorities. The extraordinary encounter between farmer and bear had catalyzed not just protection for specific remarkable individual, but evolved perspective on relationship between human community and surrounding wilderness, recognizing both separation and connection, both difference and shared participation in landscape transcending artificial boundaries between human and wild. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass. These up, just click and check them out.